welcome to Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that covers everything and anything from an evolutionary perspective. My name is Dustin Erdos. I'm a graduate student at the University of Kassel in Witzenhausen, Germany. I'm studying sustainable agriculture and beef production, and have a guest that I found through a rather unique path. Before graduate school, I was working at a cattle farm in eastern Pennsylvania and was grazing the cows every day, and also reading a lot of evolutionary science on ecology and the history of cattle. And I started wondering, what was the psychology like of those people that were domesticating cows? I was lucky enough to have my boss be a retired medical doctor, very curious about the subject as well. He had an old copy of a book by Julian Jaynes called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's a tough title to get your head around, but it's a fascinating book that has some really interesting claims about human evolution, incredibly well argued. So as I studied through the book, I found the Julian Jaynes Society on the internet. It's a society founded by our guest Marcel Kauston, who has now edited actually 2 collections, the second of which he's here with us to talk about. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So we typically have our guests talk about how they became interested in your case, in human evolution, and also the connections to another discipline. In this case, sort of the psychology. There's so many disciplines involved in the bicameral mind theory. So perhaps we'll have you talk about that in a second. But for readers who aren't familiar with Julian Jaynes or bicameral mind theory, maybe you could just give it's an incredibly complex theory, but if you could attempt to just give a brief picture of what we're talking about to someone who hasn't ever heard of the research.
Sure. I was interested in psychology and evolutionary psychology, and then and also consciousness, and came across a book review of Julian Jaynes's book almost 20 years ago now, and was really impressed with his ideas on consciousness as being better than anything else I'd seen out there. And sort of in a nutshell, what Jaynes argues is that as humans evolved language, along with language, the brain was using language to then convey experience between the 2 hemispheres, which were operating in a more, let's say a less integrated fashion than they are today. And this idea is a little shocking to people initially because behavior was then directed by what we would today call an auditory hallucination. But there's a lot of evidence that he presents for this, and the ancient literature is filled with all of these examples of people's behavior being directed by what they interpreted as the gods, idols that they used to elicit these commands, and just quite a bit of evidence that he gets into explaining all this. And then from that, he realized that consciousness was not what people kind of generally assume to be a biologically innate, evolved process, but it was something that was learned, and it was based on language. So after language got to a level of complexity, then we developed this ability to introspect, and so he places the date for the development of consciousness much more recently than traditional ideas.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great summary. So now maybe we can talk about the new collection that you just edited is called the Julian Jaynes Collection. And I'd just like to talk about, maybe in explaining your background a little deeper, your first book, as well as a collection from multiple authors around the Julian Jaynes theories. How did these books come to be? How did you network? Who have you networked with? And maybe you could describe why your first book came to be and why this new collection came to be. And then we can talk maybe a little bit about what's in the actual Julian Jaynes collection.
Sure. Well, I started the Julian Jaynes Society shortly after Julian Jaynes died in 1997, and it came about really because I had just posted an essay I had written on the theory online, and I was really amazed to see the response I got
And what year was this?
This was in 1997.
Okay, great.
And I started getting emails from people all over the world, and it was really pretty amazing. I realized I'd really tapped into something, and there was people really worldwide that were very interested in these ideas, but had no one to talk about them with. And the internet was just getting its legs at this point. So a lot of people were getting online and reading things about Janes online, and then I realized there was such an interest level out there that I started building the website, and it just grew and grew and grew from there. And then in the it was around 2004, 2005, I was talking with just a person I knew who was involved with a small psychology publishing company, and they were looking for books, and I had said, well, I have this idea, I've been wanting to do a book on this theory, and so they were very interested, but the time frame that they would need it done by would not have allowed me to really take the time to write an entire book on my own. So I had already been in touch with other scholars that were very interested in Janes's ideas, and decided to do an edited collection with chapters by different scholars. And it's kind of nice because in the first book, Reflections on the Dawn of Consciousness, you have perspectives on Janes's theory from people with backgrounds in psychiatry, psychology, anthropology, ancient history, and the study of China. And so you get a lot of different perspectives. So to make a long story short, that psychology publishing company was never really able to get off the ground, and I decided to start my own publishing company instead. Although I had interest from some of the larger academic publishers, I just thought that doing it on my own was, there were a lot of benefits to that. So the book's been very successful, and people have read it in over 30 countries now. So there's a real ongoing interest in these ideas.
And so is that why? Was it just this continued interest, and maybe discuss the unpublished, the Julian Janes collection is now contains some significant unpublished works by Janes himself.
Right, so then, just a few months ago I released the second book. It's called the Julian Janes Collection, and what that contains is pretty much all of Janes's articles that are relevant to the theory finally in one book, because a lot of them are articles that would be hard for people not associated with the university to get a hold of. And I also included all the major interviews, some of which were previously unpublished, things that I had gotten a hold of, and discussions that were from rare audio tapes, discussions, question and answer sessions that he did after lectures, as well as some lectures that I was able to get a hold of that have never been published. So in the collection, he discusses a lot of the ideas that people had a lot of interest in that he was not able to include in his first book. So he gets into the relevance of the theory for things like dreams, child psychology. He talks about the mentality of tribes and the relevance of that to the theory. And he also gets into things like the nature of the self. So a lot of the stuff that he had promised a second book called The Consequences of Consciousness, and that never materialized. So a lot of the ideas he would have discussed in that book, readers are going to find in this book that I've just released.
Great. I want to talk about some of the consequences of consciousness in a second, because I think readers of Evolution, This View of Life are very interested. Obviously, consciousness has such a huge impact on our ecological and cultural evolution. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about misconceptions and sort of critiques and general acceptance of the bicameral mind theory, because it's a really fascinating thing. I find, let me just maybe share my experience of, because it's a fascinating theory to me, and I talk to my friends about it, and colleagues as well, and I find two things. So many people haven't heard of it. Young people, almost especially, I don't think I've ever met a person, I'm 29, I don't think I've ever met a person yet of my generation that's heard of it. And my boss, for example, who's a retired medical doctor, cattle farmer, and very well read in all fields of evolution, when I told him of my interest, he said, hasn't that been discredited? But now it strikes me sort of a parallel with evolution, that a lot of these misconceptions, the critiques are always seemingly based on misconceptions. I've never found a credible or convincing critique, and I'm wondering if yet it doesn't seem to be, you don't see tons of papers, in peer-reviewed journals. So could you talk about this? Do you agree with my picture, and why do you think this might be?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I do agree completely that most of the critiques of the theory are based on misconceptions, and I try to address those in the introductions to the books as well as on the website. But there are a lot of young people that are interested in the theory, maybe more so in the U.S. A lot of young philosophy and psychology students are definitely finding the book, and I get a lot of email from people of all ages, really, and so there's definitely the younger generation is still finding it, and hopefully, I've been able to help get the word out about it as well.
Definitely.
So some of the misconceptions that people have, they either form an opinion without actually reading James's book, just reading a review of it or a summary of it, or they skim it, or for some reason misunderstand some of his arguments. And the most common mistake is that they are criticizing what James is saying based on their own view of consciousness rather than how James defines it. And consciousness is defined so differently by so many people that when you go to conferences on consciousness, you see all these people giving lectures, and they're all really defining it in very, very different ways. And so James takes a lot of time to carefully define what consciousness is and what consciousness is not. And very simply, he's defining it as what's introspectable. Now, he gets into a lot more detail than that, but he clears up a lot of these misconceptions that people go around with, that consciousness is necessary for all learning, that consciousness is necessary for sense perception, even things that are very counterintuitive. For example, we need consciousness for things like thinking and reasoning, whereas in fact, a lot of problem solving takes place unconsciously, and we may set up a problem consciously, but then the solution comes in a flash of insight. So it's very hard for people initially to wrap their mind around the fact that consciousness is much less than what we generally attribute it to.
Yeah, I would agree, and then I think on a more simplistic level, also paralleling, and because it is a theory couched in evolution, there's obviously religious objection, no doubt.
Yes, James didn't set out to explain the origin of religion, but through the ideas that he came to, he really came to what I consider the best explanation of the origin of religion, and that is that we had what I described earlier, this bicameral mental model where in stressful situations we would hear a voice directing behavior. Now, there's very good evidence today that that's still taking place in people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia and things like that, that they're not just hearing random voices as is commonly believed, but they're hearing direct behavioral commands in a lot of cases. So all religions are based on divine revelation, and according to James's theory, all divine revelation is based on auditory hallucination. So there's a lot of controversial aspects to this, but it gets very interesting once you really dig into it. But yeah, I think
it really is fascinating. Yeah,
a lot of people do have difficulty with some of these more controversial aspects, whether they're sometimes aware of the basis of their objections or not. It's kind of interesting when you talk to people. I think sometimes they have reactions to some of these things, but they're not always completely aware of why they're reacting to it in sort of a knee-jerk response.
And what about modern neuroscience? Has that been able to weigh in on the subject? It's a subject beyond my ability as a agricultural student, but do you know of people's work who have either discredited or supported?
Yeah, that's one of the most important areas of new evidence vindicating James's theory. And when people say, I've heard that a lot as well, that what you mentioned earlier is like, wasn't that discredited? And I'm not really sure where that misconception comes from. I think it's just the fact that, up until these books that I've released, there just wasn't a lot of discussion, and so people sort of made the assumption that, well, since I haven't seen much new, it must have somehow, somewhere been discredited, even though I've never seen anything specific. But in fact, the opposite is the case. And starting around 1999, 2000, the technology was available to finally start imaging the brains of people while they were experiencing auditory hallucinations. And what they found was the neurological model that Janes had proposed more than 30 years ago, that auditory hallucinations were emanating from the language areas in the non-dominant, or in most people, right hemisphere. This was all confirmed. And so that got a lot of people really interested in Janes's ideas again. And since then, in the last decade, there's been numerous studies confirming this, that the experience of auditory hallucinations involves this right-left temporal lobe interaction exactly as Janes had proposed. And the reason that the voices are experienced as coming from outside oneself or alien to oneself has to do with the fact that they're coming from the right hemisphere in ways that we still don't really understand. So modern neuroscience has really confirmed a lot of what Janes was arguing before the technology was really available to confirm it.
Great, thanks. So the last thing I sort of wanted to get into, you mentioned Janes's proposed second book, The Consequences of Consciousness, and to me that's the power of Janes' work. What the book did for me was to just provide such a realistic context for how consciousness must have emerged, with the sort of sloppiness to it. Prior to reading his book, you almost imagine it must have been a snap thing, but wondering if you could just talk a little bit about his idea of maybe you could give us sort of a preview of what his view of the consequences of consciousness are before we, or perhaps that's too big.
Well, we can touch on a few things. For example, sure. If you think about most mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety or different problems that people have, they're all problems of consciousness in the sense that one's internal dialogue has gone astray. So before consciousness, you wouldn't expect to see things like that in the full modern human context, where someone's internal dialogue is leading their emotions in maladaptive ways. So some of the other things that Janes wasn't able to address in the first book that are in the Julian Jaynes collection, they're really compelling areas of evidence for his theory that he didn't address previously. And that is, for example, dreams. It's also kind of related to the consequences of consciousness, because people have this view that dreams have always been the same throughout human history. And I've never met anyone that didn't have this view. And in fact, there's a stark contrast between the dreams in ancient civilizations and among tribal peoples and what we call modern conscious dreams. And in these ancient or bicameral dreams, the dreamer is almost always asleep in his bed. He's not seeing himself acting in different situations. And then he's visited by a god or dead ancestor who issues commands. So it's kind of the same experience as they're having in their waking life. And it's only with consciousness that we're able to have these dreams, that we're able to see ourselves doing things vicariously and in different situations. So it's sort of consciousness operating during sleep. So that's another real interesting area of evidence for the theory. And then he also gets into how there's these parallels between pre-literate societies and ancient civilizations, where a lot of people will say, well, what about tribes? Why didn't he discuss that? Well, he had a chapter on that. It wasn't included. But the experience is very similar to what we see in these ancient civilizations, where they're actually having this auditory hallucination experience on a regular basis, and so there's a lot of discussion of that in the new book. Wow. And then the final thing to touch on is just the fact that children are not born conscious. It's something they learn. It's taught to them through language by their parents and by society. And some of the latest research in child psychology is also providing new evidence for these ideas that Janes was talking about. So there is new research there as well. And the whole idea of consciousness being dependent on language, it's something that's been around a long time, and it's seeing a lot of renewed interest by people like Daniel Dennett and a lot of others. So those are some of the things that are addressed in the new book.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on. If folks want to find out more information, see the references, and really understand Jane's arguments, do you want to tell them the website, which is also the only place at this point? Will the book be going on Amazon, or is it exclusive through the Jane Society?
Right now, yeah, it's just exclusively through the Julian Jane Society. Eventually, it'll go on Amazon, but I can't say when we're going to do that. So
Okay.
the best thing is just to order it from the website, and that is julianjanes.org, and it's JulianJaynes.org.
Okay, we'll get that on the website as well. Great, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion.
Thanks for having me.